connecting to cloud server. And it still doesn't give me that option. So
it's okay, it'll record properly.
Okay.
On video.
Well, I'll just get started in a second. So just give me a sec here. Hello, everyone. This is the final installment of Criticism Inside Alternatives Alongside, Organizing Otherwise to Intervene in Anthropology's Future. Taylor, Nelms, and I have no idea how we came up with that title. It's such a tongue twister. But what it did for us was give us the space to have 10 conversations with some fascinating people, anthropologists, non-anthropologists, people in academia, people outside academia, to reflect on the various kinds of engagements and forms of inquiry, new objects, new theoretical foundations that anthropology and allied fields finds itself in the world that we live in today. This series of conversations was generously supported by the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, as well as the School of Social Sciences at UC Irvine, which provided a lot of the logistical support, and also hosted our Zooms and stored our recordings, where you can go and listen watch and listen to those 10 conversations that we had over the past several months. I do want to acknowledge that this series of events and the UC Irvine campus and its servers reside on the ancestral and unceded shared territories of the Achaman and Tongva peoples in a region that extends from the Santa Ana River to Aliso Creek and beyond. And as members of a land grant institution, we acknowledge the Achaman and Tongva as the traditional land caretakers whose efforts to steward and protect the land continue today. Taylor, do you want to briefly introduce yourself? And then maybe Nina and Kim can introduce themselves. And then we'll get started with the debrief as we reflect on what these past few months have taught us.
Yeah, Bill, thanks so much. So my name is Taylor Nelms. I'm the Senior Director of Research at the Filene Research Institute, which is a nonprofit research organization that looks at a range of questions related to consumer and cooperative finance. But I'm an anthropologist by training, like Bill. In fact, I studied at UC Irvine and got my PhD at UC Irvine with Bill as my supervisor. And we've since been engaged in a whole range of conversations, including this one that started before the series, and I'm sure will continue after this series, looking and trying to think through the forms of knowledge production and dissemination that the opportunities for new forms of knowledge production and dissemination in a really changing world, and a changing institutional forms, as well as, of course, the pressures facing higher education more broadly. I'll maybe just kind of start with a few reflections that we started with way back at the beginning of this series, Bill. And then it'd be really interesting, I think, for us to kind of work through the conversations that we've had over the past several months. But before we get into that, let's introduce our co-hosts on this series, Nima Yolmo and Kim Fernandes, who have really served as our moral compass, I guess, for the series, along with Nima Medvedeva, who's not able to join us today. So Nima and Kim, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure, I can go first. My name is Nima Yolmo, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Anthropology, UCI. And my research largely brings together notions of how do we think about money technologies in relation to statecraft and economic subjectivities at our times.
And my name is Kim Fernandes. I'm a doctoral candidate in education and anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. My research focuses on disability and the ways that it is quantified and made legible to the state in India.
Great. So Bill, as I think back to our very first conversation, I was really struck by a few of the things that have kind of persisted over the course of the conversations. I think the first one that matters a lot to me is the ways that all of our speakers have really challenged the idea that there's some kind of great divide between work in higher education and the political and social pressures of doing that work in higher education, and work and the pressures people face outside of higher education, outside of academia. And I think Noel Stout, who we'll talk about in just a second, really, really emphasized this maybe the most of anyone, but it was there in all of our conversations. The idea that, you can find some kind of outside to the social and political pressures of like working under capitalism, right, is an illusion. And we're facing different pressures depending on our institutional positions and of course our social and political positions and positionalities, identities, and so forth. So I think that that's the most kind of glaring thing that we introduced right at the beginning and is kind of fed throughout the whole series. The other one that's really interesting and important for me is the importance of finding we in our very first conversation, we talked about fellow travelers. We've been challenged on that, most notably by Sarita Amrute at Data and Society. But, in some ways, I think that the idea there that we were trying to get at, the idea that there's a kind of community of practice of folks really invested in thinking differently about knowledge production and dissemination in this moment, that I think really persists. And I hope that in some ways, the folks that we've had on and the folks who have been listening to this series are the kind of beginning of that community of practice, right? And
I think if I could tell, one of the really important kind of take-home points for me, just looking back on these conversations and thinking about how our own thinking and discussion has changed since we started with Joan Donovan back in the very beginning. I think it has to do with the kind of challenge to that notion of fellow travelers, and also the challenge to the idea that there is a great divide. But then the next step is that demands us to think about some new kind of institutional formation or organizational form that probably isn't the university, right? Or at least not the university as we know it, that will allow for these kinds of work and these sorts of discussions and also these sort of world-changing projects to take place with, all of us in a kind of distributed network of people practicing and thinking together. And I think that, one of the real challenges is that, in many ways, this series that we set up was motivated in part by the idea of precarity, right? That kind of academia is in a precarious place. The job market has shifted probably irrevocably. The position of experts and expertise has been under threat globally around the world with the rise of populist movements and demagogic political figures like our former president, but others around the world as well, which really kind of challenges the notion that somehow academia is this sacred space of thought and knowledge and science or whatever. But in a way, I think we've learned that our very investment in that idea of precarity prevents us from taking a next step to then think about how do we organize differently, right? Precarity can lead to a woe is me, woe is us, why doesn't anybody listen to us, which allows us to preserve our position, in this, imaginary ivory tower apart from everything else while the world crumbles, instead of validating the kind of jumping into the frayness that we experienced in the conversations with some of our interlocutors. So I think that one of the real challenges taking this forward is trying to imagine new institutional forms.
Yeah, or more broadly, new forms of solidarity, maybe, right? New forms of community within which institutions can take shape. New kinds of institutions can take shape. So let's talk a little bit about, we'll just kind of go conversation by conversation and see, this is really organic. We don't have too much planned and we'll just kind of see where the conversation goes. But our very first conversation was with Joan Donovan. And Joan, let's see if I can find her, her affiliation.
She's the research director at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. And Joan is a scholar who studies disinformation and has been very, very active in also imagining new forms of civic media and media activism. And some of what Joan talked about in our conversation was her work building the infrastructure, the communications infrastructure for Occupy, which also led into some of her later work challenging media disinformation. I wonder, Nima and Kim, like what jumps out at you as you think back on the conversation with Joan? What were some of the things that really stuck with you? And I'm going to keep doing that, by the way. Sorry, guys.
No, nothing to apologize for. I was actually looking at these transcripts because it's been like such a while, right? I don't know, maybe pandemic time is just different than like regular time, but now Joan feels like another lifetime. And I was thinking back to two of her book recommendations that are really stuck with me, both Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology and Design Justice, which when I go back to the transcript, she talked about as two books that she looks to think about how you get people to understand the research that they do and what does it mean for this to serve a broader public, right? So what are these handoff points? What are the touchstones? And she also asked, what are those places where you are asking for feedback or input or actually collaborating with folks that are going to be impacted by either the technology that you build or the concepts that you bring into this world. And for me, that was a really useful framing to think with and to open the series with. I wasn't at the very first conversation, but going back to it, Bill and Taylor, the one that I think the two of you had, you all were thinking about many of the things that anthropology as a field is sort of struggling with, including, as you just talked about, Bill, precarity. And you all basically set out sort of a boundary where you all said, you know, we don't want this to be a webinar that focuses on the job market, but we want to think about people's intellectual investments and their locations at their sites. And I've really been sitting with a lot of Joan's questions around getting people to understand the research that they do as engaging with the broader public as a way in which to think about both alternatives and the people that we travel with.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Kim. I was struck by both her call to engage the communities that we might otherwise be studying, right? In the work that we're doing, the knowledge production and dissemination, but also her call to then, in some ways, reverse the research gaze or the ethnographic gaze to become ethnographers, not of those communities, but of our audiences, to better understand what triggers they care about. What are the motivations for them to be able to put work in front of them that then they take action on?
And it really, really nicely flowed into the next conversation with Mary Gray, right? Mary Gray, senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research, who also is now a genius, yay, recent recipient of the MacArthur Award. And Mary, I mean, she really kind of offered a pretty strong indictment of our field, right? That we're trained to talk in ways that nobody that we study would ever be able to understand, and that maybe the thing isn't to go and learn the fancy language that nobody but us speaks, but to learn how to speak more broadly. That was one of the things that really came out of that conversation for me. I'm not sure if others want to chime in here. Nima looks like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I also really like the way it flowed from like John's first episode, and then we came to Mary's, and thinking about also public communication, how do we think about like civic engagement, and also very important questions about like, how do we, like the language in the academia that Mary pointed out, how that relates to, in some ways, careerism, wherein there's a sense that we're doing the most radical things just for ourselves, but there is no communication happening beyond those very circles, almost like by intent, which raises, I guess, like other questions of how do we imagine the university as a public institution? How do we think of knowledge as something that contributes to democratic functioning, wherein people have debates outside and otherwise? And what we consider a radical, what is like narrowly defined, is not self-contained within these spaces. So I think that was something really important to take away, particularly in relation to developments in technology. How do we understand so much of what is new that's happening like in our everydays? So that was like very, I think that set the tone in some ways, like for me when I think about the series. How do we think of the relation to the public and civic, both in terms of responsibilities, but also in terms of aspirations? Like, what is it that we want? We want the public to be, or democratic, functionings, but also like systems to be. So that was helpful.
Yeah, and what role do we want our work to take, right, in relationship to those those aspirations around what kind of public might exist, right? And here I'm really struck by, Bill, I think it was you who made this comment in relationship to something Mary said about how maybe what we're after is not solutions, but resolutions, right? In the sense of like a New Year's resolution, right? A commitment to doing differently and keeping things going differently. A reference, I think, to Jean Lave, right? And her cognition and practice. So I'm really struck by that too. And I think that that's something that we come back to over and over again as well. This idea that what we're after when we're after doing anthropology or doing social science or doing academic work or just research differently, right, is not the clean break, but simply the opportunity to continue to try things, right, to try things out and to try to keep that space of possibility open.
I know it's jumping ahead a little bit and we can go back to going in sequence, but just the one little like hyperlink from this to something else later is in the conversation with Noel Stout, I think it was, someone posted a question saying something like, is this the next step of the corporatization of the university, right? And again, thinking about, not solutions, but resolutions and opening spaces to occupy that maybe don't sit comfortably within this division between, pure university and neoliberal corporation. I lost my train of thought, but kind of, obviating that gives us other things to do. And it, for me, one of the most radical things of this entire series that we did together that came out of it came from CUNA Mutual, right? Came from credit union land. Yeah. And Angela's challenge, where is she here? Angela Russell, Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, CUNA Mutual Group, okay? Like an insurance company for credit unions, talked about maybe we need to think about not like just building the world anew, but helping the current world to die, right? And she talked about how with all of the structural transformations that we're seeing in the United States in particular, but in the capitalist North, as kind of the promises of capitalist modernity start to run out their time, and as we have, white supremacy resurging as the last gasp of a dying set of racial formations and formations of racial privilege, that maybe our job is to provide hospice care to that social formation. And that just blew my mind, right? And it gave me a whole other way to think about stuff. And again, where did it come from? Like the corporation. So, like it's almost as if these distinctions don't help us or stand in our way more than they take us to a new place. And sorry for jumping ahead.
No, that's okay. So to bring it back to the conversation with Mary Gray, one of the things that she really emphasized, right, that Nima was just talking about is how, kind of our training in academia doesn't equip us to do more than to move beyond the moment of crisis and critique, right? That we are really trapped in a moment of either diagnosing crisis or producing for the most part, kind of pretty formulaic critiques of critical moments, right? And so, I think she was very explicit. She was like, we need to train researchers to take the next step after critique. And that could mean building, or it could mean helping to disappear, helping to die, right? Those are both steps after critique in one way or another. So I was really struck by, right, the resonances there as well.
And to add to that, Taylor, I was just looking at Mary's comment on the role of disciplines in interdisciplinary work, or in work where we have the kinds of fellow travelers that may not necessarily be with the same training or the same departments. And Mary talks about some of the dilemmas you just addressed between like, either formulate critique or really feeling stuck, and talked about this as working with fellow travelers to think about like the role of disciplinary belonging in interdisciplinary work, and in like, and sort of, I believe Mary said this as like staying as much as she could in anthropology to keep her feet to the fire, so that there would always be a group of people who would call her out around the rigor of her approaches. And for me, that was generative in thinking beyond this sort of binary of stuckness versus critique. And like anthropology's role in, or at least our training, right? Even if not necessarily our location in the academy, our training, the role of our training in thinking about what makes our work ethnographic or anthropological.
Yeah, I love that, Kim, the kind of necessary ecology, right, of knowledge production that keeps us honest, right, in some ways.
I wonder if that's where where Sarita comes in, right? Sarita Amrute was our next conversation. Sarita is the director of research at Data and Society, and also he has a university affiliation, which I'm forgetting what it is. We don't have it on our website.
She's in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Washington, I believe.
Washington, yeah.
So what really struck me about our conversation with Sarita, I mean, a lot of things that I learned in that conversation, but one that I really took away was her emphasis not on the role of fellow travelers, but on the role of newcomers, right?
Yeah.
And how important it was to cultivate spaces. And Mary was really explicit about this as well, right? Maybe in a less kind of theorized way, but really, really focused on how do we build institutional spaces where newcomers are welcome and encouraged, and there's very clear pathways of support, right, to secure their participation.
Not sure, Nima and Kim, if you want to jump in here.
Or just generally, what stuck out to you from the conversation with Sarita?
To me, Sarita talking about like, regardless of like institutional location or kind of, what work you're doing right now, what her emphasis on like tracking and tracing the regimes of power at work, or looking at like contradictions in the way that she says race or class or technological solutions play out, and like moments of dissent at these levels, was also visiting just right now our conversation about Mary and the very useful sort of stuckness that she pointed to. I thought Sarita's entire talk was so sharp and really challenged us, but this in particular allowed me to think about ways of engaging with what anthropology has to offer and has given us, regardless of where we may be located or what alternatives come to look like.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I really think that, what with regards to that, she really pushed us to think through kind of what a Gramscian approach to kind of strategy and intervention might be, right? What kinds of counterconduct, right? Like what might we want to engage in or support, right, in our organizations and in other organizations, to kind of orient our strategies, not necessarily to specific outcomes, but to the alignment of interests, right, in the world that might produce alternatives. I thought it was really useful, kind of slightly different framing, right, than the one we had been using.
There's a real, for those who are interested in and are following at home, there's a real interesting like dialectical tension between the conversation with Mary Gray and the conversation with Sarita Amrute. And I'm just going to put that out there, and you all can go discuss sometime.
I would almost throw in a triad to that, which is the next conversation we had with Hannah Appel, right? Really, really different approaches in all three, right? Even though I think, in many ways, they're also aligned and in alliance. But let's talk a little bit about the conversation with Hannah, which was, also incredibly productive.
Sure, and Hannah is Associate Professor of Anthropology at UCLA. And Hannah also introduced probably more F-bombs into our conversation than anybody prior and anyone subsequent to her. So many.
You're talking about fiscal action, right, Bill?
Yeah, no, not the word fiscal, not the word finance. It was a different F word, and it came up repeatedly, so much so that it made some Jenny Fan, who's here in the background, a little nervous about whether we had to go and edit it out later. But
absolutely not. No censorship in this series.
Nina Kim. I think Nina's trying to unmute. Yeah.
There I go.
There you go.
Yeah. Actually, as I was thinking of the question and also thinking of Hannah's talk, I was thinking in the background how there seems to be the Occupy, like as a foundation to many of the, like activities, actions, like thinking about solidarity that like came up. And I was just realizing it as we are talking about all of them and how that seemed to be a moment that a lot of people kept going back to in thinking about organizing, in thinking about ways of like resisting that informed their work. And in Hannah's work, that was kind of much more clear. And in some ways, she's also taking it forth with the Debt Collective. So that was I think that was very important to think about like these influences and involvements that have shaped not only scholarship, but also continuing engagement with activism and building of solidarity outside. So I think that was, in a way, a good model also to begin thinking about, like how to talk about these things in the classrooms, how to talk about our own like personal convictions and commitments. So that was, that's something that I found really important in her talk.
Yeah, I think.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Kim.
No, go ahead, Taylor. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, she introduced a different way of talking about the fellow traveler or newcomer figure, right? And for her, it was the dangerous partner, right? So not fellow travelers, not newcomers, but dangerous partners. Who are your dangerous partners? And sometimes those dangerous partners can be, folks that you organize with and alongside. And sometimes those dangerous partners are like the institutions of liberalism. And so she really introduced this this interesting and almost necessary tension that has come up in the Debt Collective work. And she talked about it in relationship to the ways that the Debt Collective, method, as well as inspiration, was taken up by like John Oliver, of all people, right? And the ways that in activism, even radical activism, sometimes the sign of a kind of quote unquote major win is the yoking of that method or that community to liberal institutions, or even institutions of law.
I also think, to both your points, Nima and Taylor, what sort of rounded out that conversation for me was one of the things Hannah said toward the end, where she was talking about our need to understand how racial capitalism intersects with things like gender, and to really locate ourselves in these histories in a deep, enduring way that enables us to, of course, think through what the role of the neoliberal university is, but also to name this inextricability as we go about doing the work that we do.
Yeah. It's interesting to me too that Hannah's work kind of demands a new kind of studying up, and I don't mean like necessarily the Laura Nader way of studying elites, but kind of really studying up on how stuff works, right? Like don't just stand in the position of critique with respect to an institution, but really figure out how it ticks. Like, what are the parts that articulate, that fit together, that make something happen? And that's really very much the work that the Debt Collective and the other organizations that Hannah's been involved with, that's been very much what they've done, right? They figured out, how does the secondary market in medical debt work? And then they intervened in it, having figured it out. And it really does take that kind of studying up on stuff that's kind of boring, right? Where there isn't, the immediate like critique of its neoliberalism is obvious, right? Like Mary Gray said, like we can get really good at going over to a disaster scene and saying, look at this disaster scene. But it's that next step of pulling it apart and figuring out like how it all is built and functions. And then figuring out what are those kind of, critical control points where you can intervene. And that's something that one of Hannah's mentors, Bob Meister, has written quite a bit about as well, with respect to debt, but also looking back into the history of various forms of organizing against different capitalist formations.
And I was also really struck in the conversation with Hannah, maybe she didn't put it quite this way, but the willingness of the debt collective to, even once they found a relatively successful point of intervention, to kind of be willing to leave it behind to do the sort of the next step, right? And so for the next step for them was, okay, like, yes, we can intervene in this existing system, but to transform that system, we need to get to the moment of organizing, right? Mm-hmm. And so they, we can intervene, that's important, right? But it's not the only thing that we should be doing, or by any means the last thing that we should be doing. And so they've really left behind that idea of, we're just in the business of debt forgiveness. No, actually, we're in the business of organizing people for debt abolition. And so I think that there's something really important in being willing to, let things go even when they're successful, to be able to get to that next point of, often it's organizing, and organizing in the service of abolition, as well as creation.
That's a super important point. And that's also like the John Oliver error, right? Is that it turned into this kind of, in the hands of John Oliver, it turned into this liberal project of salvation, instead of a more radical project of transformation, of transformative organizing. And that, I just have to say, like, that whole notion of leaving behind, right? Sort of doing the little experiment and leaving it behind is kind of like what happened in the discussion with Eli, right? With Eli Dorkelson, who talked about kind of walking away, right? Sort of walking away from academia. I'm not sure I know where I'm going to go with that. Maybe Nima, I think you're going to jump in. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was thinking this was something that was related in terms of when you were talking about like hospice, and it's such a nice way of like thinking and about it, but also like the phrase itself, like it's not about killing, or it's not about like being done with, but actually helping something through its demise. And then with I think with Eli, it was so helpful to see that like how it's about structures, but it's also at some level very much about like people in terms of interpersonal relations, in terms of the way like what like as much as we talk about precarity, we also talk about like the toxic environment within the academia in terms of like relationships, and to put that center stage about like what are the things that we can actually work on here and now, even as we are thinking about the larger changes that we are talking about in terms of thinking anew or thinking of the same things in a different way, or letting go of some of the things. I think it's also important then, how do we put in the personal relations? How are we responsible to each other? How do we care? I think that was central to what Eli pointed out, like, and very, very crucial also, because it goes into the heart of like how relations work out within the academia, what kind of support structures are present, what's the culture, and how do we build on this is very, very crucial, irrespective of how we think about other institutions and how we do like work and scholarship. If we don't know how to be with each other, then there's very little that we can envision in terms of other ways of being.
Yeah, I love that. Go ahead, Kim.
Sorry, Taylor, I always speak over you. Go ahead.
No, please.
No, this is awful. I'm so sorry.
I was going to make a very simple point that I loved how beautifully paired our conversation with Hannah and our conversation with Eli were, right? And in some ways, I feel like they were talking about the same phenomena at different scales, right? And so I really appreciated Eli's focus on, there's a few things, right? Like, but especially exactly what Nima was talking about, the focus on the fraught politics of identity and solidarity at the interpersonal level, and how that really produces the foundations or the conditions for organizing otherwise. That's all. Go ahead, Kim.
I was actually just going to build on that, because Eli framed precarity and identifying with or being, defining their relationship to the academy in a way that like sort of really blew my mind, where they talked about how, as Nima mentioned, relationality was at the core of what it meant for them to try to not identify as an academic, because they said the infrastructures were not really there for them to do so in a way that kind of feels good. And later, commenting on precarity, they also talked about the ways in which conditions can be so tenuous, so emotionally unstable, and so invisible. And I think in imagining what kinds of futures remain open for us or can be created for us as anthropologists, this centers relationality even more so as important in how we continue to locate ourselves and identify our fellow travelers.
That's wonderful. I'll just throw one last point in here, which was this really important point that Eli made in telling a story about the importance of ritual in enacting this kind of politics of relationality that we've been discussing. And so I was really, really struck by the story that they told about, the moment of leaving, the moment of transition, and how important the ritual can be, right, in building interpersonal relationships and solidarities, but also, I think, to the point that we started with, one of the points that we started with, Bill, around institutions, right? Mm-hmm. And how important, new rituals might be, right, for us in thinking about anthropology otherwise, or academia otherwise.
Yeah, some kind of branding, sorry. But I mean, really, one of the things that Eli was saying was that, the existing relational and affective structures in university departments is a kind of branding, right? Like in the worst possible way. Mm-hmm. And there needs to be an intervention. So the next conversation was with Alberto Corsin Jimenez, reader in Department of Social Anthropology at the Spanish National Research Council in Madrid. And I have to admit, I remember for this conversation that my internet kept going in and out. And I remember just being very stressed out about that, and hoping that that nobody could tell.
I couldn't tell. Nobody could tell.
Okay, we can go back and look at the video and see how noticeable it is. If I'm like every so often, that's why.
Okay. Kim or Nima, what stuck out to you about our conversation with Alberto?
The emphasis on the public sphere, and honestly, sort of Alberto's own engagements with defining the future scholarly public sphere, and the work that he's done towards sort of building Libraria, maybe I'm not pronouncing this correctly, but thinking about what it means to create work alongside other people. And I don't know why I'm sort of really thinking with fellow travelers today, because more so than, I guess, locating one's, I've been thinking a lot about the question of what enables us to locate ourselves in the ways that we do. And Nima's point about relationality has really hit home, as Nima and Eli, as sort of central to the futures we imagine. So I thought Alberto's was a great model of possibility and of futures that maybe outside the US, but can certainly be thought of in the US and other locations.
Yeah, I kind of, building on that, Kim, one of the things that struck me in that conversation was how he historicized solidarity, and particularly he kind of like pointed out how like certain ideas have like, are like spatial and historical in the way like it emerges, and the kind of work that we are able to do has to draw from a particular history of like resistance or solidarity, understood in a particular way, right? Like, so I think like that was really like interesting for me to think that, like, especially when we are reading text, like there's a sense, like there's a general understanding that we have a certain common language or some level of legibility. And it was really good to hear about his involvements and the design projects that he was involved in, where he kind of pointed out that it comes out of like certain historic moments in spaces that he's working with, and people having their own understandings that of solidarity, of designing otherwise, that they bring to these projects, which I think is crucial for us also to think of, like not only in terms of difference, but but also because these are moments of engagement that we can expand like our own ideas, also build upon and draw from. That was helpful.
Yeah, I love that. And there's a kind of hyperlink built, just like you said earlier, but to the beginning of Sarita's conversation, in which she really very carefully placed herself in a transnational family history that I think was really, colonial, kind of settler colonial and British colonial history, right? That I think was really, really important. And similarly, Alberto was super insistent, right? That when he's working on free culture, right? Free culture communities, free culture activism in Spain, like you have to understand the history of not to put too fine a point on it, anarchism and fascism in Spain, right? To be able to understand the opportunities and affordances that kind of playing with ideas around free culture, or ideas even around the idea of the prototype, right? Which is a really important point for me in that conversation, that those are all deeply inflected by that local and at once transnational experience.
Yeah, it was a real fascinating kind of corrective, in some ways, to the conversations that had gone before, because it forced us to do that work of defamiliarizing some of the ways we have been talking about some of these words like public or infrastructure or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and I love, where we ended that conversation, which was less on knowledge production and more on knowledge dissemination, sort of a link back to conversations with Mary and Joan about, what do you want to do with the work that you're doing, and who do you want to do it with? And so, for Alberto, that meant reimagining the infrastructures of publication, which I think is a really critical point as well.
And we should just say, which I think that our field still does really poorly. Like even in its attempts to create things that are supposed to be for public dissemination, it's really just for us.
Yeah.
Sorry, Wenner-Gren Foundation. Thank you for supporting this series of conversations.
which are like about, the public, whatever outside, and is mostly just us talking to each other.
But then there's Angela Russell, yay.
But actually, so yes. And we did, there's 10 conversations. I think we tried to find ways to interrupt what we imagined would be our trains of thought as we went through, right? And so a lot of like the scheduling was just due to like when people could join us on a Friday at 11 Central or 9 Pacific US time. But we were able to shoehorn Angela Russell in a way that I think did, like Alberto was interrupted some trains of thought. I think Angela also interrupted certain trains of thought in really, really useful ways. And we've already talked a little bit. We
already talked a little bit about it. I want to quit my job and go work with her.
I would work for Angela in a flat second. Don't let anyone at Filene hear me say that. But
I don't know if I have to get like a giant tattoo on my arm though, like she did her first day of work on the job.
Yeah. Kim and Nima, what struck you about our conversation with Angela?
Thanks so much. Like I guess part of this is not answering your question directly, Taylor, but I think all of these, I think it'll take me a long time to think through. So when I was reading the transcript also, so one of the questions I was thinking of putting to you two was, okay, what are your impressions and what did you all take away with? And we are, I guess, gradually coming out of it. But Angela's was one of those like conversations. I feel like there were so many like nuggets that could be directly applicable and so like insightful in terms of like, how do you think about your standing? And she's in this, like, you know, in a corporation doing like insurance work. And she's like changed so much of that. It also reminded me a lot of what Bell Hooks talks about in relation to education, right? Like universities being elite institutions, and oftentimes like it's not about reversal, but like undoing those powers. But how do we do it? Strategies that we are not like familiar with, like they're not as known, they're not as well, I mean, they're not that many work. And modes and infrastructures of communicating that are there. So her talking about, and I guess like many others, and Kim, I and Nina had a conversation later in terms of how do we think about these institutions within corporate spaces that are doing like anti-racism work or trying to undo some of the structural stuff, and how there are always limitations. But I think her insights were so like valuable, that because she talked so much about strategies and she placed herself and her own negotiation, and also that constant awareness that like anytime like this is something that she might lose, and yet like we have to like continue doing it. So I'd say I took away like more impressions about like strategies and the person. And I think I still have a long time to like process the whole thing, because in my mind I'm just like, yeah, corporations and doing their PR work. And here is an example that like I wasn't like familiar with, as to how do you navigate within such places and still do meaningful work. So that's where like I'm at with Angela's episode.
And the question of meaningful work, like I've been coming back to Angela's talk a lot because of, I remember asking her a question about Sarah Ahmed's writing about diversity and coming up against brick walls. And Angela phrased this super succinctly when she was like, I don't think of my work as brick walls. I don't kind of think of it as constantly having to bang my head, because I feel like that would be the kind of place I don't want to be in. And she also pointed to sort of thinking about change more realistically as, what can I get done in the day-to-day? What am I able to do with those who are traveling with me, colleagues or otherwise? And that for me helped undoing some of the stuckness that we were talking about earlier, particularly around, that binary between like being stuck and critique.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that continually inspires me about conversations with Angela is that she is able to engage in the work that she does at the same time that she can imagine what is necessary to undo in that work. So she has this incredibly self-critical or self-reflective stance towards the practical work that she's doing, even as she's engaging in that practical work with real, positive outcomes for many of her colleagues and the wider community. And it's that stance that, I talked about folks who I, may as well be anthropologists, right? That kind of feeling, right? When you kind of find those people in the world. And Angela may as well be an anthropologist, right? Like there's no, there's nothing that she does, I think, in her work that would differentiate her in any substantive way from what I would try to do in my work as an anthropologist. And so that, when I think about like letting go of anthropology, I think part of it is that, right? Like my PhD in anthropology doesn't mean much in terms of my differences from the ways that I engage with my institution and broader community than, and the ways that Angela engages with her institution and broader community. She might as well be an anthropologist. And I think that that kind of stance is just, incredibly generative. And Bill, not to give you a big head, but it really reminds me of the way that you talk about the alternative as not a place of a space of permanence apart from, but as a temporal modality that you engage in, that you literally alternate back and forth between. And if you think about the way that Angela talks about her work and the way that she actually does it, it's this alternating between different modes of practice.
Yeah. And for me, as someone, still in an academic institution, that conversation really got me thinking, how do we train people to be able to do this? Right? How do we train people to be able to do that kind of phase work that Angela can do? And it's a lot's involved in that, right? Like teaching people to get over themselves. You know, I mean, I don't mean it to sound too like psychotherapeutic, but teaching people to, you know a canon, but also know when to get over it, to know a disciplinary identity, but also know when to get over it. I mean, this is some of the stuff that, you know, our other compatriot in these conversations, Nina Medvedeva, would bring up from her own interdisciplinary location in a sort of gender studies academic formation with no discipline, quote unquote.
Well, and exactly what Mary Gray talked about,
Yeah.
you know, in one of our very first conversations, right? And Kim, you brought this up earlier, the really productive stance of being able to, I think she says she relishes the opportunity to be forced to translate her work for, you know, like non-anthropologists and non-academics, right? And at the same time, needs to stay in touch with her colleagues in her discipline to hold her feet to the fire. That phase work is, it's really incredibly complex, but I think that is at the core of being able to kind of navigate these, you know, new and emerging worlds of knowledge production and dissemination. We need more professors of the practice who are like Angela, right? Who then become mentor, you know, based on their set of expertise and experience, become mentors for people to do that work, right, out in the world.
Well, let's shift to Federico. That was our next one. Our second to last conversation was with Federico Nieburg, professor of social anthropology at the Museo Nacional in the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Thinking about emergencies.
Kim or Nima, any introductory thoughts?
I was just going to add another word to Bill's emergencies, like timeliness.
Yeah.
That's the big takeaway for me.
Yeah, go ahead, Nima.
That was the only, I found that like so helpful in thinking about like timeliness, because as what Taylor was mentioning earlier in terms of like analysis and diagnostic of crisis, and then talking about it. But then when he spoke about it in terms of like thinking about time and timeliness, it felt like it was like a pause that even within that moment of crisis, we needed to like collect ourselves and then think ahead. And think in some ways what you in another conversation Bill had mentioned about how do we think about our intellectual agendas in a world like that's changing, when there's like policy changes, and as in the case of Federico, when there are like emergencies. So I think that's something for me to stay with and think more about.
Yeah, Federico.
They just did it again. Kim, go.
I have awful timing. I'm so sorry. Please go, Taylor.
No.
No, come on, Kim.
This is good.
I was also thinking about the question that I'd asked Federico on like, what do changes in federal funding and just overall politically in what's been happening with higher education in Brazil over the last few years, what do they mean for how we train students of anthropology? And I'm sitting with the way Federico responded to that, because he said, you know, it's an important issue, but I don't quite have an answer to it. And what we imagine is sort of what we then go on to make together, even amidst all of the kinds of challenges that we're having. And I appreciated that, because I think with so many of these conversations, but I think Federico's explicit articulation particularly, they've left kind of spaces that continue to bring up questions or enable us to continue these conversations rather than having neater answers. So I still think about that question as maybe like we will not know, but we build together.
Yeah, I love that, being able to kind of operate in ambiguity and in uncertainty about what the outcome will be, right? And I think that actually that there's a really important point here. I didn't think about this previously, about the connection to something Sarita said, her critique of the nonprofit kind of theory of change model, which was it doesn't take into account, or it rarely takes into account the unexpected or unintended consequence, right? that in fact, we're operating with a real profound sense of uncertainty about what will our work, what kinds of outcomes or impacts our work may have, and what might be possible working together, right? And so I think there's a really nice way in which, Federico, I kind of sense of humility with which we need to engage in the work that we do. And that go ahead, Bill.
Oh no, which just to link back for a second to something that Eli said, right? Eli said, everyone quotes Bill Redding's The University in Ruins, but the university isn't in ruins. It's just always being melodramatic, right? And again, that gets back to having to get over ourselves, right? University is not in ruins. It's just gone through and going through a series of institutional challenges and crises. And instead of thinking about the kind of working with that those require, a lot of liberal academics just throw up their hands and get all melodrama about it and be like, the university's in ruins, it's the neoliberalization of everything, and inquiry is dead. It's like, okay, then what are you doing? What are you doing right now? Yeah,
the number one employer in 15 or 20 states or however many it is the state university system still, right? So come on, the university is not smoldering. Yeah, but there is a timeliness to the intervention that's required, right?
Yep.
Which I think is what Federico was pushing on, which is really important. He was quoting Carl Polanyi, which I love.
Yeah, and I still want to find that, what that original source in Polanyi is, because I don't remember it. We have to ask him.
Yeah, we need to ask him. The other thing that I was thinking about, I have an incipient. Oh, go ahead, Nima.
Oh no, go ahead. Finish your thought, and then I have one point.
I don't know where it's going, so I'll just throw it out there, and maybe Bill, you or Kim and Nima, you can run with it. So one of the things that a common thread in Federico's work, right, in his entire career, is this focus on the moment of emergency, especially as it impacts economic lives and livelihoods. And so he's done a lot of work on inflation. And so I've been thinking a lot about inflationary expectations as a metaphor or a model for us to think about the work that we're doing in this moment, right? We're in this, and I don't even know where to go with that, right? But the inflationary expectations are this idea, right, that if people expect prices to rise a certain amount, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? There's a kind of performativity to it. And we're in a really interesting moment kind of monetarily right now, where we're going to start to see some transitory inflation just naturally, right? And most people, right-thinking people, right, understand that it will be transitory because the actual structural conditions in the economy have not necessarily changed, the labor markets and unionizing, to actually push wages and therefore prices across the board up in a really sustained way. So we're not actually in danger of any kind of hyperinflation, the kind of which that Federico has studied around the world. But there's a way also that with that moment of transitory inflation, right, with influx of capital from a whole variety of sources, everybody all of a sudden, they've been saving up over the past year. Now maybe we'll have a little bit of opening up with vaccines and the COVID, kind of sort of post-COVID moment, that we're going to get a little bit of bump, and people might start to be like, oh, inflation's coming. And so expectations change, and with expectations, it then becomes this whole thing. And the Federal Reserve is saying, we want to find a way to put a damper on inflationary expectations so that it doesn't produce this kind of cycle. I don't really know where I'm going with that, but there's a way in which that moment is kind of analogical to the moment we're in now in terms of imagining other forms of organizing or institutions, and the role that our expectations or aspirations play in setting off virtual or vicious cycles.
That's super interesting, Taylor. Yeah, no, I know it's something to kind of continue to think on, I think, especially as we think about what kind of future organizing looks like, and what it's toward, right? Is it toward both providing assistive supports for things to have their demise, and providing assistive supports for new kinds of relation building and knowledge formation and practice, right? And this is also where we were in our last conversation with Noel Stout, on the research faculty at Apple University. And what was glorious about this conversation was how much couldn't be said. And we talked about non-disclosure agreements and what they mean, and the sorts of things that Noelle could not share, while the things that she could share were in some ways very mundane, right? I mean, she's like, I teach classes on like gender, just like I would, you know, in the university when I was at NYU, but I left all of that and now I work for Apple. Nima, Kim, oh.
And just the big difference, right, is that she's teaching Apple employees.
Yeah.
Like she's like executives and engineers and you know, HR folks or whatever, right? Like about theories of capitalism, rather than NYU undergraduates.
But that space Noelle is in, or others like her are in, are not without, I guess, really, like I was thinking back to Ian's question towards the end on whether Noelle sees what's happening as, you know, the corporatization of the university, or the logical next step in the relationship between academia and the corporate world. And she was talking about like the need for, or her desire to see more people who are working in contexts like hers to continue to speak back to anthropology, to also like understand how anthropology has been shifting and changing, and how folks outside of the academy shape the discipline. So I'm sorry, these are a lot of like scattered thoughts, but I've been thinking with that question too, because it ties back to sort of, I think, the comment at the very beginning from the first conversation for this webinar on like speaking to students, not just about like the job market, but also about where people's interests are and where they're located as a way of seeing the discipline.
Go ahead, Nima.
You know, I was thinking of everything that all of y'all said, but also like to your points, Taylor, on thinking about inflation. I was thinking how it's so much at the heart of like central bankers to control inflation always, and like give it a number beyond which it can't expand. And so like, you know, like even going back to that and thinking of what would be like the value of deflation in this, and who, like, you know, what kind of benefits can come about. And I think like my point was too, like the earlier thing we were thinking about, like what Eli said about like the university and like the melodrama. You know, we hear a lot of anecdotal accounts of like faculty, say like 20, 25 years ago, refusing to be a part of union or unionizing because they did not identify as workers, right? Like, so this in a way, like elitism, this sense of self-identification, which now like to us like would seem surprising, because those are like the way the rights are eroding, especially with adjunctification and all of that. And these are central conversations to thinking about universities otherwise and alternatives. Yeah, I guess like those are some of the things that were like coming to my mind as we were having this conversation, that it's crucial for us to also look at like revisit like the ways in which academia self-identifies, like the hierarchies within, you know, like within teaching itself, or like research across universities, within universities, faculty positions, and then coming back to the older question of like, yeah, like what are the cultures, and what do we see as our contribution to being in the society?
And maybe even to carry the analogy through a little bit further, you know, what's our role as this kind of dispersed distributed network that we very much had on display during the series of webinars in, you know, shifting future conversations away from inflation targeting in the economy, or like in our metaphorical sense, and toward, you know, fiscal management, right? Which is the other way that we think about what central banks do, the kind of Keynesian kind of problem of dealing with the fiscal side of the house instead of just the money supply part, right? Which, you know, starts to sound like modern monetary theory, but it's just Keynesianism. It's just about maybe there need to be political decisions about taxation and redistribution to satisfy other societal goals, like in Keynes' case, full employment. And if this means then that its modern instantiation is something like an income floor, which I've started to like the word better than universal basic income, just because I can
Job
say
guarantee.
job guarantee.
To tie it back into this kind of, precaritization problem, right? A job guarantee would accomplish that and much more.
Mm-hmm. And then, that would then, lend in favor of something like a works progress administration for the kind of people that we found as our fellow travelers during the series.
A Green New Deal for anthropology, Bill.
A Green New Deal for the social sciences more broadly.
Yeah. I mean, I think just to draw this back into the conversation with Noelle, I was very struck by her commitment to changing anthropology, right? And I think for her, it is incredibly important to find ways to fold the work and experiences and learnings of people who, have found work or have found other connections, right, to institutions and networks outside of academia to find their place back inside of academia, right? Whether that's through publishing or through teaching or through whatever, sharing, right? To kind of seed change in the institution. And so I wonder, Bill, being in your position, like, this is a question that you asked right at the very beginning, right? Like, changing higher education is kind of a place where we ended. Like, where do you see that happening, right? Like, where are the kind of channels or levers of change that you see?
I mean, so much of it involves just the basic recognition first, as you said earlier, Taylor, that, the university is not in ruins. It employs a ton of people. It has a ton of money coming from the state, even though our budgets are always under assault. And, in the University of California, we saw a gigantic budget cut that then was partially and then wholly restored, but still at levels below what we think we need to operate. But nevertheless, the money's there. It's a matter of kind of channeling it into the right places, right? And kind of thinking about building a set of shared understandings and conversations within the university about what its function is. And, is its function tech transfer? I mean, sort of, yeah. Is its function, democratic civil participation? Yeah, probably, maybe. Is its function, the function of other big, huge forms of public infrastructure investment? And those of you who know me here know that I always use the Hoover Dam as an example, whose job it is to simply remain there for several generations, doing what it does, because we never quite know what we're going to need in the future. And I think that gets back to that kind of, planning for the unplannable, much like the Hoover Dam, right? It still supplies all the electricity to where I live, a huge chunk of it. And the things that we do with electricity were unfathomable back when it was being built. And I think we need to get our minds into that multi-generational timescale always, as we try to get the timing right with the interventions that we engage in right now. And that's also going to help us with other things, right? Having that multi-generational timescale helps us then think in a real way about equity and reparations, right? Helps us think in a real way about different projects of abolition and their necessity, whether it's data abolition or, the kind of writing and talking that's been going on around the abolition of the university in its current formation, or the abolition of the kind of white annuity that continues to generate returns to people who look like me, even though, my ancestors didn't participate in the kind of wealth formation that that they benefit from tremendously, right? I mean, all the time, always. And we need to bring awareness of that benefit, of that annuity, to folks, so that we can start thinking about undoing it, dismantling it. Just that. I don't know.
I love the point that you make about planning for the unplannable, because if you think about not to get too wonky again, I feel like I introduced like the inflationary expectations thing, like took us in a super wonky
That took us in a very wonky direction.
But useful, maybe, I hope. But I mean, I think that there's also something really powerful about the metaphor of planning, because oftentimes when we think about planning in juxtaposition to something like the free market, it's about asserting total control, or at least that's the popular perception. And in fact, what I think you're pointing to is a very different understanding of what planning entails, which is more like foundation laying or infrastructure building, or I don't know, right? Like we might think about social infrastructures, like solidarities and communities that we want to form, right? And the ways that those hold open spaces of possibility for things that we could never predict. I like that vision at the university. I actually think that that's Hannah Appel's, that was, when she reflected on working in a university and then engaging that organizing and activist work outside the university, that was her point, right? So super, that it opened up a space of possibility for her.
And maybe this is where we wrap up, since we've been going on now for a little more than an hour. Let me once again thank you, Nima and Kim, and also Nina in absentia, for being our fellow travelers on this crazy journey for these, 11 sessions that have spanned several months during a pandemic. And as we are all in multiple time zones around the world, pretty much getting all of them except for Singapore. So all the time zones. And thank you, Taylor, for getting us all together and instigating this. Thanks again to the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research and the School of Social Sciences at UC Irvine. All of these conversations are available. The video is available. There are transcripts. I don't know if they're available or not, but maybe we'll put them up somewhere. I think they're all available as well. On the social sciences website at UC Irvine. You can just Google and you'll find it. Thanks to those who participated over these many weeks. And we will figure out ways to keep this going.
Nina or Kim, any final thoughts? Maybe we'll ask you what's the one thing you want to do with this, or is this enough? Time to move on.
I think with some time, we can revisit them and see what we can do with them. I think we'll need some time to kind of think on them. But my next sentence was going to be thanking you all, thanking you both, Taylor and Bill, for getting us to be a part of this, and also Kim and Nina for being there.
Yeah, these were such generative conversations that I don't think I would have had or engaged with in this way prior to kind of this webinar and this space more broadly. And maybe even this pandemic, I don't think I've attended as many webinars during this time, but I think the one thing that I would want to do is to sit with these conversations. Like Nima said, I don't know necessarily that they mean something immediately, but thank you to all of you for opening them up. And I'm excited to see where these go in our heads and in practice.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone who's watching any of these. Yeah.
Well, thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Dale. Thanks, Taylor. Kim.